You get a book out there, well, congratulations, you and 300 other thousand people put out books that month on Amazon. So now what? You got to promote it. And so we went on the podcast where I thought that there would be, potential customers as listeners. And there was nothing wrong with the shows, but the ideas that I had in the book, the ideas around money mindset, around profit first, and the false paradigm that being profitable and being creative were contradictory. Those weren't the conversations they wanted to have, and we were having. So that's why I said, well, I'll just start my own show.
Welcome, business podcasters, to another episode of Podcasting and Professional Services, the podcast for business podcasters. I'm your host, John Tyreman, founder of Cedar, where we build media brands for experts like you. Today, my guest is Christian Brim, founder and CEO of the Core Group and the host of The Profitable Creative and The Chris Project. Welcome to the show, Christian.
Thank you for having me on, John. Pleasure to be here.
First, I think you were telling me before we started recording, but can you give our listeners the quick story behind the shirt you're wearing?
Well, yes. It says front towards microphone. It is a Claymore anti-personnel mine. And I was at a convention conference in Dallas earlier this year called Military Creator Con. And it was the first year they'd done a standalone event. And they invited me to speak, and I was at a workshop, and they had these shirts for free. And I'm like, that shirt is awesome, and I'm going to have it. I have had one person in a crowd say, cool shirt, but it's a very niche thing, right? Like, I mean, you got to get the context for it to make sense.
Sure. And folks that are watching this on YouTube can see the awesome shirt. But if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, check out the YouTube channel so you can see Christian and I have this conversation. So, well, Christian, I think what's cool is we're both coming into this conversation already having a little bit of rapport. I was a guest on your show. I'm also a client of the Core Group. So it's cool that we have that existing rapport. We can kind of jump into this. But our listeners, they might not know of you and the Profitable Creative.
Likely not.
So, well, let's introduce them. So, according to your LinkedIn page, you founded your firm almost 30 years ago, which is crazy. Can you set the stage for our listeners? Tell us a little bit about the Core Group and the kinds of businesses that you serve.
I started out long ago in the accounting services business as a franchise in 1997, and always have worked with small businesses, helping them with compliance related accounting things, taxes, payroll, bookkeeping, those kind of things. About 3 years ago, we decided that we wanted to really pick a target market. And we decided on creative professionals as our target. And we did that with this very high level MBA analysis of asking the question of who are our clients that we most like to work with and see the most value in what we do. That was our deep MBA type analysis. And what kept rising to the top were these creative professionals. And so we said, okay, we'll do that. I'm not going to lie. There's been a couple of times of the last 3 years that I'm like, why did I do that? I should have gone with plumbers. But why I did it, and I think over the last 30 years I've come to realize that I had this resonance with creative professionals, people that were passionate about what they did and wanted to make a business out of it. It wasn't just about paying the bills. Every business has to do that if they're going to survive, but creative professionals had this spark that I really identified with. And so we work with creative professionals. We're in the middle of doing a huge pivot on what we do for our clients. And I can talk about that if you want to talk about it, but I'll finish the story by saying 2 years ago, I published a book, Profit First for Creatives, a derivative of Mike Michalowicz's book. And I went on podcast. I'm not a podcast listener. I'm still not. And I went on these as a guest to promote the book. And I after about a half dozen of them, I'm like, I'm not having the conversation I want around this. And so I said to myself, I'll start a podcast, and did that, having no idea what I was doing. And I'd still argue 2 years later, I'm not sure that I still know what I'm doing, but that's how I got here.
Okay, so let's compare. First of all, I want to compare and contrast creatives to plumbers. So,
Mm.
what's frustrating about creatives that you think plumbers would be a little bit easier?
Well, I'll be honest with you. The reality is the vast majority of owner operated businesses, creative or not creative, struggle with numbers, right? It's a necessary evil. It's something that you've got to have done, but it's not something you embrace. And for 29 years now, I've always known and really been on a mission to take business owners beyond that level of it's just to make sure your taxes are done and you're not in trouble and you're not paying too much in tax, that whole paradigm, to how do you use that information to inform your business decisions. I knew that was what really was missing from all business owners. And it still's missing, frankly. But the difference with the creative business owner is a lot of them come to the business with some additional baggage around money. And it usually shows up in a couple of different ways. The first is there's oftentimes shame, which is weird, shame around money, because they've been told, well, why don't you get a real job? What you do is not real work, right? Like that whole, creative work is not real work. There's this second nuance that, it's not universal, but creative business owners tend to think less linearly. Their brains don't gravitate towards spreadsheets and numbers the way, say, accountants or engineers do. And so there's this shame struggle around, like, I should know this better. I should be able to know more and do better with my numbers, but I just can't seem to figure it out. And then there's this third element where it's like some creatives think that profit somehow, the money somehow taints the creativity. Like that if I do something for money, that somehow makes it less creative. So there's some nuances in the creative professional's mindset that make it a distinct problem.
Interesting. And so, that's where I can see how some education around value pricing and understanding the value of that creative work and the reframe that needs to happen, because the creative process comes naturally to creative people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
there are others who are willing to pay for that.
Yes.
All right, I want to explore what is the pivot. You hinted at that. So what's the pivot that you're in the middle of doing right now?
Well, so we set this up at this military creator con. There was a workshop, a day-long workshop with two individuals, Christopher Lockhead and Mike Damphouse. I had never heard of either one of the individuals, but they are older than I am and multi-published authors. Chris has got 15 books. I don't know how many Mike has. And I'm like, how have I never heard of these guys? And they volunteered to come to this event because it was associated with the military. Mike's a veteran, Chris is not. But just because they were passionate about the veteran community. And they did this workshop on category design, which is what both of them do. And it really crystallized some things that had been running around in my brain for a couple of years. And they gave me words to describe my feelings. And essentially, category design is creating a business that is different, not just better. And you see this all the time, but the category design is about creating a new solution. So the examples that he used, there were several in tech. So you can think Uber, you can think Airbnb, but it applies to any business model. One example he used was Gojo, the liquid soap. Didn't understand that is a 3-generation business that was started by a husband and wife, Flo and Jim, I think. I don't know, Flojo. Gojo, not Gojo. Gloria. Anyway, Gojo. Yes, I'm saying the correct words. Anyway, Gojo, the wife worked in a factory, and she would go to clean up at the end of the day, and all there was this nasty bar of soap. And so she invented with her husband liquid soap. It wasn't the same thing as like you've got on your bathroom counter now. It was an industrial application, right? And this business has thrived on creating something new. I mean, soap isn't new,
Right.
but what they do is solve the problem of clean hands. And what that meant 3 generations on, where the granddaughter is running the business now, they created hand sanitizer. They own Purell. I had no idea that they owned Purell, right? Wow. But it was all around obsessing over solving this problem of clean hands, right? As opposed to saying, I'm going to make a better soap. Right. So that's the paradigm that I left there with. And so we've been, the leadership team for the last 2 months has really been dialing in on what is missing from the marketplace. What is not being solved that still needs to be solved. And I'm not ready to share what we've come up with, but we've got the problem. We've just started working on the solution, and I'm very excited for it to launch later this year.
Will you be making an announcement on the Profitable Creative podcast?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Well, then I guess listeners will have to tune in, especially the creative professionals that are listening. So that's totally cool. Love the teaser. So we've been talking, Christian, for 12 minutes now. We haven't really dived into your podcast. I'd love to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned 3 years ago you went through a repositioning, and I'm going out on a limb here. Is that when that's when you decided to focus on creative professionals?
Correct.
So that happened around the time that you launched the podcast. That was 2024.
It was a year before.
Okay.
So the first year was really just kind of to feel out what was going on. And then the team came up with this idea of, well, why don't we write a book? And I'm like, well, okay, let's do that. And never had written a book. And that was an entirely novel, painful process.
Nice.
Got the book out there. And then, of course, you get a book out there. Well, congratulations, you and 300 other 1,000 people put out books that month on Amazon. So now what? It was, you got to promote it. And so we went on the podcast where I thought that there would be, potential customers as listeners. And there was nothing wrong with the shows. It was, but the ideas that I had in the book, the ideas around money mindset, around profit first, and the false paradigm that being profitable and being creative were contradictory. Those weren't the conversations they wanted to have, and we were having. So that's why I said, well, I'll just start my own show.
And so you decided to have those conversations, and you launched the Profitable Creative in 2024. Out of that, it looked like early on you were publishing about weekly, and then you made the decision to publish more frequently than once a week. And by looking back, it looks like it was like a Tuesday, Thursday cadence. What went into that decision?
I wish to say that, well, I would like to say that was, like really smart, and there was a lot of thought put into that. It was simply, talking to other podcasters. It was like, well, the more you put out, the more downloads you're going to get.
Yeah, right.
And so it was just a more frequency equals more downloads. That was it. And I'll go ahead and say, we're on a hiatus. We haven't recorded in a week. We're taking a hiatus for the summer. We're not pushing. We've got several episodes in the can, but we're not putting anything out. We're doing that intentionally to see what difference it makes, because that was the other thing, is we built this thing without any real strategy behind it, and we think it has an impact, but we're not real sure what that impact is. The direct attribution is not a lot. So we're kind of doing this experiment. But while we're doing the experiment of not putting out more content, we're also re-envisioning what the podcast should be. Like, all right, what is the strategy behind this? Mm-hmm. Are we having the right types of guests, producing the right kind of content, having the right kind of conversations to support core from a marketing standpoint? I don't think there's been anything wrong. I think I've had some very brilliant guests and very brilliant episodes with what we've done, but it wasn't overly intentional. It just was, kind of an afterthought.
One thread that's emerging for me in my conversations with podcasters is podcasting can be as much of a sales investment as a marketing investment. And what I mean by that, it really is a vehicle to take relationships to the next level. So going from a LinkedIn connection to a podcast guest to a collaborator to a client, right? That's a threat. That's a common path that I've seen across my client portfolios and the business podcasters that I've talked to. So you mentioned that the attribution wasn't a lot, but has the podcast netted new business for you?
Absolutely. I think you were a guest after you became a client, but I think you're an example of how it could work that way. I will tell you, I was a guest on a show very early on 2 years ago when I was promoting the book, and I come to find out, and he was very upfront about this, which was very odd to me. And I can't even remember the podcaster or the podcast name. But essentially, he used the podcast as a sales tool. Like, he only had people on his show that he wanted as customers.
Sure.
And that kind of turned me off, because I'm like, that's not the vibe I'm going for, right? But I don't think that you should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think right. Conceptually there's a place for it.
Yeah, totally. And I think that if you think through the different personas, for lack of a better term, prospective clients, people that represent your ideal client, absolutely should be a persona that you pursue as a guest. But I think referral sources, other people that have expertise that is valuable to your target audience. So thinking of things from like a tangential point of view, I think for accounting firms, it's also like bringing in people from your team onto the show can be a great, not only to showcase like the expertise internally to prospective clients, but I've also found, and this was kind of unintentional, when I was a host of a podcast at a digital marketing agency in the early 2020s, I would interview internal subject matters within the agency on technical topics like SEO and paid media and analytics. And it turns out that those conversations had an impact on our recruiting pipeline. There were senior level candidates who reached out and said, "Hey, I listened to your podcast and it sounds like you got some really smart people on the team. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out and have a conversation."
Yes.
So what are the different kinds of guests that you've had on, and how do you approach the types of guests that you bring on your show?
Well, at first it was, we signed up for Podmatch, and it was really people pitching us, right? At the very outset, I was, like whoever I could get on the show. I had my daughter. She's a figurative oil painter, and I had her on the show, which was a humorous episode, to be honest with you. I did have a couple of team members from Core on there and interviewed them. But as I got into it, I started to actively reach out on LinkedIn, people that I thought were interesting in the space. Now, not to say that wasn't like they could or couldn't be clients. That wasn't the metric I used. It was like, do I find them interesting? Do I think that they would have an interesting perspective? And because I wasn't really dialed in from the beginning, I had a whole. I mean, I had everybody from authors to people that worked in out of home media, which I didn't even know what out of home media was, but essentially billboards and those kind of things.
Right.
All over the place. And I think when we reconvene, I think we're going to be even more targeted and in the guests. And we might have to dial back the frequency to once a week if, to keep the quality where I want and not focus on just the numbers. That's a vanity metric. It's like looking at, website views. It's not
Right.
it's not necessarily important. It could be, but it's not necessarily important.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors and qualifying criteria that would make podcast downloads and views important in that context. So, what has been, podcasting is awesome. This show is all about podcasting, but sometimes it can be a little frustrating and sometimes it can be aggravating. So,
Yes.
I'd love to hear from your perspective. What's the worst part about podcasting?
Well, I think I say the worst / most unpredictable is you never know. Well, the way I do it, I don't necessarily know what the episode's going to be like, in the sense that I don't have a script of questions. It is the way I describe it is I have a conversation until I find something interesting and then I pull on it. And it, you just never know what you're going to get. I've had some really low quality episodes, some that I didn't even publish. Like, this isn't even worth putting out, right? But surprisingly, I never got to the point where I felt like I needed to do pre-screening calls or something like that to make sure that I got good guests on. I had one author that came on the program, and if I had, that was the other thing. I didn't do a lot of research on my guests before they showed up. And I had an author on there, and as he's responding to some questions early on, he keeps saying Shakespeare. And I'm like, what is going on? And then I realize, and he tells me, he says, like, I'm sorry, I have Tourette's. And I'm like, oh, okay, that explains the random Shakespeare, right? And I'm like, let's dive into that. And so
Yeah.
he told me all about that experience, about Tourette's. To be honest with you, I didn't know a lot about it. And it was a fascinating interview. It really had nothing to do with him being an author. And so, like, it's not necessarily a bad thing that I didn't prep. Hopefully I wouldn't have excluded him from the show because of that. But it was a complete surprise.
And I think what that does is that story really showcases the personality aspect of podcasting. Your
Mm-hmm.
personality is more of a conversationalist, like you mentioned, and then you find something to really dig into. Whereas there are other, some of my clients, and there's a lot of different podcasters out there. They need to be more structured with their
Mm,
questions and then everything in between.
yeah.
I just find that so fascinating, and I just a quick go on a soapbox real quick. I think that podcasting in the personality behind it is going to become more and more important as
Mm-hmm.
AI continues to evolve, as we see, we question what we see on the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very human conversational type of forum where we can kind of showcase our human qualities. What do you think about all that?
I think that's a brilliant observation. I think there is 100% a trust gap in general, and I think it's going to get worse. I think that if you're just doing a podcast to come to some predetermined content, like I'm going to have a client on and I'm going to ask them like, how did court change your life? Like that is too easy to reproduce, right? From a technology standpoint. And it's going to ring hollow, even if it isn't AI generated, it's going to,
Yeah, that's a good
feel,
point. Yeah.
feel scripted, right? I don't know that it has to be as completely maniacal as mine, where there's zero structure. I'd like to have a little more intent behind what I'm doing, as opposed to it just be, to be honest with you, over the last couple of years, the Profitable Creative and the Chris Project have been kind of a creative outlet for me. So it's kind of been a hobby. I love talking to people. I love hearing their stories. Very rarely do I talk to somebody that I don't find something interesting that I can dig deeper, like, and I learn things, right? So I don't want to lose that aspect of it, because that's what gives me fuel. If it's just a grind of, oh God, I got to go do another recording, then you're going to show up with the wrong energy. But at the same time, does it have to be a free for all? No.
There is a little bit of structure to what you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about, though. Maybe there's a little bit more of a container that you need to create
Right.
around
Yes.
it, less so than like specific structure, because different people, and again, that goes back to the personality of the host and what kind of environment do they thrive in. Where if you put too much structure on someone who does like to have more freeform conversations, that can limit the personality factor of the content, right?
Absolutely.
um and
But I
it,
think,
it
in just thinking this through, I think it really is more being about more structured with who I have on the show. That I
okay.
think is probably the first thing that we will do, is be more systemic and have more, not rigid, but more guidelines of like, who are we trying to get on the show.
So do you foresee the Profitable Creative being solely that interview based show, or are you considering varying up episode types, like having more monologues or bringing on a recurring co-host, for example?
I think those are both brilliant suggestions. I think I've done one solo episode on the Profitable Creative, and it actually is one of the most popular. But for me, it had it wasn't really interesting. Like, I went on there and I talked about S corps, and I've intentionally steered away in the content around, you know, technical stuff, right? Like, we don't talk about what's deductible for a creative business and what's the
Right.
latest tax strategy. Never did that. But I did that one episode, and I didn't script it. I freeformed it. And I was just basically, you know, it'd be like if you came to me and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about it being an S corp," and then I just kind of unloaded my experience with it. That was really what the episode was. But to your point, it's probably something I need to do more, and not necessarily just me, but it could be other team members.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that I've kind of noticed is like podcasters sometimes can get into a rut
Mm,
with thinking that there's only one path that they can go
mm-hmm,
down, and they've
mm-hmm.
structured their show in this way and that's all it can be. But really, like, you're in control. You're not beholden to anything, right? You can release a monologue episode. You could have, a past guest back on to have a continuation
Yes.
of a conversation. And so, like, it's cool to see podcasters that I talk with, that light bulb moment go off. They're like, oh yeah, like maybe I should try that. Go
As
ahead.
you're saying this, I'm thinking, like, I used to listen to a lot of radio, right? And
Hmm.
usually it was talk radio, and it was, a lot of sports talk, where, you
Me
get
too.
these idiots call in and, give their
Yeah.
opinions, right? But even like, when you just kind of open the box and say, you're producing entertainment at its core, right? And so, like, going back and looking at, the Orson Welles, and the day the earth stood still, right?
Yeah.
Like, old radio, old TV, Carol Burnett show, Dave Chappelle show, like, what is possible. Like it doesn't have to be just what I've landed on.
Yeah. Oh man, I had something there. It'll come back
Dave
to me.
Chappelle. It was the funniest show ever put onto TV. I will
I
tell you that.
completely agree with that. 100%. He's a master comedian. But Christian, what I'd love to do is you mentioned the Chris show, and I would be
Mhm.
remiss if I didn't ask you about that. So that was a passion project for you. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I started the podcast at the same time because I was like, well, if I'm going to do one, I might as well do two. But it strictly was to scratch my own itch in that I had this client story that had haunted me. And the word haunted is real. Like it haunted me for over a decade. And I was like, I was telling some of my entrepreneurial colleagues about it, and they were like, you totally need to do this show. And I'm like, oh, is anybody going to
What's the
listen?
story?
Okay. So the story is I had a client decades ago. He was in his mid 50s. He had a successful manufacturing business. And he got to the point where he was burnt out. That's not the way he defined it, but he had come to the conclusion that he needed to hire a president to run his company so that he could literally go back to the lab. He was a self taught chemist and he wanted to go back and tinker in the lab. And he invited me to this interview with a president candidate at lunch. And this president candidate, who I had never met, regales us with the stories of marital infidelity with strippers.
Hmm.
And which I'm like, that seems like an odd thing to lead with, but okay. we left we left the lunch, and Chris, it's the Chris Project, it's named after him. He called me and he said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I think if he cheats on his spouse, he'll cheat on you. Don't hire him. And Chris went ahead and hired him. And fast forward a year, and the president gets arrested for attempting to bribe a contract officer. And he said it was all Chris's idea. And Chris ends up with a 3-year hitch in federal penitentiary.
Oh, wow.
And a few weeks before he was scheduled to be released, he took his own life.
Oh, my God.
It was an awful story. It was absolutely awful. And I'm having to deal with the grieving widow who has no idea about the business. And like, it was awful. And I was replaying in my mind, did I not say something I should have said? Is there something I could have done? And I never talked to him after he went to prison. And so I'm not sure where his head was, but with the lens of time, I could see that he was burnt out. And like he went down this road of making bad decisions, not because he was a bad person, but because he was just by himself and he wasn't having these conversations with anybody. And so that was what the Chris Project was about entrepreneurs having those conversations that they don't want to have around mindset and mental health and those kind of things. And I didn't know if anybody was listening to it until one of my friends from college, who I had not talked to in probably 20 years, he reached out to me and he said, you know, this episode about that guy? And I'm like, yeah, not this episode was this guy that was a raging alcoholic. I mean, I could not believe the amount of alcohol he consumed. And he said, that guy's story was my story. And I'm like, really? And so we had a 45-minute conversation. Again, I hadn't talked to him in a long time. And I got off that call and I'm like, okay, it did what I wanted it to do. He may be the only one that listened to it and it impacted, but I think there are more, obviously, but that's why I did it. And that's why I still do it.
Even if, yeah, I mean, it helped one person. If it helped one person, it'll likely help more. And so that's validation right there.
Yeah.
I do remember what I was thinking earlier, and it was entertainment value. And the point that you brought up around that, and stories like the one you just shared, it's captivating and it's not entertaining in the sense that, I'll get my popcorn and sit back, but it's
Right.
entertaining and it's engaging in the fact that, wow, this is real stuff that could really happen.
Yeah.
And then I got a comment on LinkedIn the other day. People don't listen to business podcasts to be entertained. And I could just call bullshit on that. I
Absolute
mean,
bullshit.
yeah. I mean, people listen to podcasts to be entertained. Business conversations can be entertaining,
100%. You
right?
want me to
And
show up and read an accounting textbook? I mean, like, what
no.
do you mean? I mean,
So I think like whether you're talking about, creative entrepreneurs and how they handle money, or whether you're talking about the mindset of an entrepreneur and mental health of business owners and entrepreneurs and business people, I think that it can and should be entertaining. Otherwise, why is anyone going to show up and listen?
yes, and to your point, entertainment is not always, comfortable, right? It's not. I mean,
Right.
nobody went to Schindler's List and thought, "Oh, I'm happy," but
Right.
they absolutely were entertained. Yes, they were engaged, they were moved, they were transformed, and that's, I think, a broader term to define entertainment. Entertainment is not just distraction.
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm glad that that came back to me, and I'm glad that we could kind of bring that back. Christian, I just want to thank you so much for being an amazing guest, for sharing your experience, hosting the Profitable Creative, hosting the Chris Show. If folks that are listening, definitely subscribe to both of those podcasts. Check out Core Group, connect with Christian on LinkedIn. Christian, is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you think it would be worth our listeners hearing?
Doing a podcast for your business absolutely is a great strategy. You have to be patient with it, and you have to, I think, to your point, think outside the box and tinker with it. But I find it very compelling. I find it very fulfilling, and I think hopefully after we retool, more productive.
Excellent. Well, you're nearly 200 episodes in. It sounds like it's been working for you, and so I'm excited to see what that retool looks like at the other end of this year after you take a little bit of break over the summer.
Yes.
Well, Christian, thank you so much for your time and for being a guest. And again, if folks that are listening, connect with Christian on LinkedIn and check out the Profitable Creative wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, John.